Okay, this is my take on chapter 236 of Jujutsu Kaisen and why I think it was a perfect chapter. There's four things I want to make clear before I start saying this. Gojo is connected to the Buddha. Gojo is a tragic hero. Gojo is the strongest. And I'm gonna sort of go against that later, but you'll see why I'm having you think that for Gojo right now. And Gojo makes empty promises. Start off with the empty promises. The first thing we see is he like makes these promises about protecting Amanai from Toji and getting her to merge with Tengen. And we see his promise of saving everyone in Shibuya when he gets sealed. And then we see when he claims that him and Geto are the strongest. So these are three promises before the Sukuna fight. And I don't really know specifically, but maybe these are the only promises he's given us. Like that have been major, and all of these are wrong. So he makes empty promises. Before the fight, Gojo makes a promise that he will win this fight, which is a clear death flag to begin with. So you should already be thinking, "Oh, this is like not good." So it it's not like super clear, but like you can basically like tell. And sorry, I don't really have a specific script for this. I'm just sort of talking, but okay. And before and during the fight, Gege hints at this sort of weird love between Sukuna and Gojo from giving each other one's company at the top or the peak of Jujutsu society. In one scene, we see Gojo feel this sort of like he might lose moment, but at the same time, that makes him feel like excited. It makes him feel not lonely anymore. And this is something you need to think about during this fight is that they are having fun and enjoying this fight. They both have these little moments of just like funny dialogue, or they're always constantly smiling, which makes it very obvious to us that they like this fight. So this brings me to one of the first things people really haven't understood, in my opinion, and it's how Gojo's feelings have changed, and that this isn't really an off-screen death. A lot of people keep saying they hate this because of the off-screening, but I mean, this is literally the newest chapter. The story's not going to end in this or even the next five chapters. In the ending of the fight, we get Gojo's POV. And this is something you really need to grasp when thinking about what's going on in this chapter. So when we first see Gojo, it's as he's dying or like dead. So it's one of those two. But he's talking to everyone who has died, all his loved ones. And specifically, we got a scene where Nanami tells Gojo that he uses his title of the strongest for satisfaction, which we know from all his past fights and this fight with Sukuna. We know he loves fighting. We know this brings him enjoyment. You know, this is something he's talks about and he sort of has an ego about. So if this is what satisfies him, why isn't the first thing we see from Gojo's POV the climax? Why don't we see him get killed? Why don't we see what satisfies him? Instead, we see Geto, his one and only, and all his loved ones. It's because he has gone through a rebirth of self in his death. And also during the fight, he shows a bunch of respect to Sukuna, which is something we've never seen him do before. So this is like in the death plane where he's seeing everyone. This is another way that he sort of like changes. But anyways, the saying "life flashes before your eyes" is something to help understand what Gege's route is for this chapter of showing Gojo's self rebirth. In death, Gojo thinks of himself, which me personally is sort of like a little reference to Buddha. Maybe not specifically, but just how Gege makes Gojo's character. It's gonna align with what Buddha also was doing in his story. So instead of thinking about his desires in the fight, he thinks about what had made him happy. You know, all of his friends in Jujutsu High who taught him. He thinks about the principal and who loved him. You know, Geto and all that. These people made him Gojo Satoru. All of these people are who made him Gojo. Not the strongest, who made him Gojo. And Panoy Boy on TikTok had a really good take about this chapter and something I didn't really think about, but like, oh, what we both came to the conclusion of was sort of the same, but he just went a little bit more in depth with it. So shout out him, and I'm gonna link to his video in the comments. Basically, he starts with this page, which sort of reminds us of the "What makes you the strongest" talk that Gojo and Geto have between each other, and below them is a panel of lotuses. So we already know Gojo and the Buddha are heavily connected, and the lotus in Buddhism symbolizes rebirth, or specifically Japanese Buddhism, but it signifies rebirth in anything, in people and all that. To further show this rebirth, there's a part where Nanami talks about how in death you can either go north to change or south to stay the same. Pinoy then talks about a panel that was mistranslated, but it was for the theory that Gojo will come back to life. And me personally, I don't think Gojo's gonna come back to life, but this isn't really a theory specific video. Anyways, my interpretation of Gojo going north is just how he changed his ways in mental rebirth at death, not a physical rebirth at death. I'm not saying he won't come back, but I'm saying I don't think this is specifically talking about how he's going to come back to life. Now, going back to Geto's old conversation of are you the strongest because you are Satoru Gojo, or are you Satoru Gojo because you are the strongest? In death, Gojo let go of what gave him satisfaction, the label of the strongest. And like how the Buddha finds himself, Gojo finds Gojo Satoru. Even Sukuna didn't label him the strongest, but instead called him by his full name, showing real respect and sort of getting rid of this I am the strongest, we're the strongest, I alone am the honored one. He sort of, all of that has gone away at the end here. And so this shows how his mind and his mindset has sort of done a rebirth. And it doesn't really matter how he died, because his perspective, he's not thinking about the fight. And we will see how Gojo died. Just because we didn't see it from his POV, though, doesn't mean it wasn't off screen. And I don't think people are really thinking about that, because that's not what Gojo was. And Gege is the best at building up hype in the unknown. I mean, we still don't know anything about Sukuna or Kenjaku. And I hate how people are giving this take that, like, why wouldn't it show him getting killed? It's a fighting manga. Well, it's not just a fighting manga. He can do either. He can make it a fighting manga, or he can make it complex. I mean, Gege really does these both. I mean, just this chapter alone, it starts with Gojo's POV of the afterlife, which hits us super deep, and it shows him accepting death and having a mental rebirth. But then it ends with the Thunder God Hajime Kashimo entering the fight, giving us hype for next chapter. So that's why you see he's not one-dimensional. I don't know why people want him to be one-dimensional. Along with the reasoning for Gojo's POV, there was a lot of people who were mad about how Sukuna was able to bypass infinity, and there's a pretty good explanation for what happened. So, in order to cut Gojo, Sukuna targeted the world of infinity Gojo makes instead of Gojo himself, and since Gojo is in that world, he got hit as well. The two problems I've seen with this is how could he do that? This is Gege breaking his power scaling. I mean, he's cutting infinity. That's a crazy feat. And also, how would it even hit Gojo? I mean, he's buffed with Black Flash, and Sukuna is severely weakened as we know. So basically, the move was an impossible out of this world feat. It was crazy, but it doesn't necessarily break the power system. The move Sukuna used was made by Maharaga's adaptation, which will never stop adapting but will only make more complex adaptations. Sukuna waited until Maho made a blueprint attack for infinity. So that explains how cutting infinity came to fruition, because we know Maho will adapt to any and all phenomenon, even infinity. The great point here, though, is Sukuna copying this move. But in my opinion, I think almost anything is impossible with cursed energy. I mean, Maho is the prime example of that. How is he able to do all this stuff with his adaptation? I mean, there's infinite possibilities. He can be anyone. It's because cursed energy, with certain knowledge, can make you basically do anything. And Sukuna is the greatest sorcerer of all time. So when Maho makes a brand new move that's not just him manipulating his own cursed energy, I think Sukuna's vast knowledge of Jujutsu would make it so he can replicate this and replicate cutting infinity. The problem with how it hits Gojo, though, is also something super easy to prove. Literally every time Cleave or Dismantle was used, Gojo never dodged it. Be it when Infinity protected him, while he was in the domain, or when Maho cut his arm off. Man, has anyone even ever dodged Cleave or Dismantle? I don't even remember, and I don't think so. Sukuna is literally just the strongest, and that's why he was able to hit Gojo. Gege Akutami gave us a perfect chapter. With all his strengths he's built up as a writer coming together to give Gojo an amazing ending. And honestly, this wasn't an ending fitting for the strongest. This was an ending fitting for Gojo Satoru.